Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Gillian Dudgeon, toka ingoa. Tēnā koutou katoa. Hi everyone, I'm Gillian Dudgeon. I know we had quite large interest in the session today, and I see we've got nearly 300 people online already, so we will get underway. Welcome along. Bridget Murphy, who you can also see on screen, and myself will jointly cover the presentation today. The meeting is going to be recorded, and so probably I think it takes about 1 to 2 weeks to get the transcript up on YouTube, but we'll also have a PDF of the presentation that we're sharing today available to send out to everyone after the presentation, so you don't need to take lots and lots of notes. At the end of the session, we'll also have a Q&A session, and we've got a Q&A function as part of the webinar. So I'm conscious that people will be joining as we go, but I think we'll get going because time is precious for everyone. So what are we going to talk about today? Right, so we're going to talk about what vocational education and training covers and how work-based learning fits into that, about the changes that have been made and will be made over the next year, the transition processes which are happening for some of our existing work-based learning providers such as HITO, Primary ITO, Service IQ, and future engagement on what we call the network of work-based learning. And we'll talk about what that means, but that's really for a particular industry to think about what are the types of providers that would best support your industry. So is it one national provider? Is it a national provider with the ability to have some regional provision? Do you want to be supported by the PTE sector, the polytech sector, or the wānanga sector? So we'll talk about all these things today. This webinar is to support industry associations and employers to understand these changes. We do talk quite a lot of gobbledygook in education, so Bridget and I will apologise in advance if we are using words that you are not familiar with, and we'll try our best to explain things in plain English. So if we move forward. So vocational education and training, and we nickname it VET. It's got nothing to do with actually vets that help your animals, but the VET sector is used to cover learning that's based on a particular qualification level. So in tertiary education, we would say that if you study a degree, that's 7 and above, and if you study an entry level sort of qualification, that's level 1 and 2. 3 and to 7 non-degree is what we call vocational education and training, and that covers all work-based learning. It's a wide range of skills and knowledge. It's got the trades like carpentry and plumbing, but also things like information technology, hospitality, horticultural, seafood processing, and production management. There are, not surprisingly, very broad range of industries that use vocational education and training. But not all training for industry sectors is covered by it. So for some of your industries, you'll have degree-based provision. That's not part of the conversation that we're having today. Now, some training is funded by TEC, but there are some things that aren't, and we'll talk about those too. I thought I would describe what a provider is, because we talk about providers all the time, but if you're not in education, you might be wondering what we're talking about. So we have providers who are registered with the New Zealand Qualifications Association, NZQA, and that's universities, polytechs, wānanga, private training entities, but also the former ITOs. So you would have known them as Primary ITO or Service IQ. And currently those organisations, most of them, are work-based learning divisions of the new industry skills boards. But those are the organisations that are enabled and registered to be able to offer training that TEC or fund. So when we talk about what don't we fund, well, as part of the government's decision to provide $4 billion in funding to the tertiary sector, there are some rules and constraints put around, and they're determined by the ministers, which are then shared with TEC, and they set the rules about what we can and can't fund. So the sorts of things that we wouldn't fund are generally those day courses or short courses which aren't linked to NZQA approvals in that space. Courses that are primarily about delivering health and safety content or regulatory compliance. The government's view that's training that an employer should fund. That's not to say that there may not be a small component of, say, health and safety in an approved program, but pure health and safety training isn't funded. And then there are also courses that are available, but they're by training providers who aren't NZQA registered, and we don't fund those. So that's just a little bit of background. Vocational education and training, so VET, it's delivered in sort of three different ways. Firstly, there's what we would call provider-based learning. You would think about that probably as training that someone goes to a campus, like they visit a polytech or they visit a PTE, and they do the training in the classroom or in the workshop on site. Now, some of that training might involve occasional work-based placements, but primarily the training is based around a campus. Then we have extramural learning, or a lot of people will call online learning. So that's usually independent distance learning. You might, as part of that, occasionally go to, say, a polytech to do a block course for a practical component, but most of your learning you do by using your computer and working through modules. And then the third, which is the one that we're primarily talking about today, is work-based learning. So this is learning that primarily is based on the job. So if you think about apprenticeships, and this is where employers have a really active role in delivering the training, so supporting their employees in getting qualified in their area. It's likely to be supported by training materials from one of the providers, so maybe it's from primary ITO, in the example of Food and Fibre. But the trainee then needs to work through those on their own in their own time, because they're employed by the employer. They have an apprentice, so for an apprentice, they have an apprenticeship agreement between the employer, the employee, and the provider that's supporting. Once again, there may be block courses, say at a local polytech, that they need to go to from time to time, but for most of the time, you're an employee working with an employer who's supporting you to become qualified. So hopefully that just explains the different pieces. So workplace learning is going through changes, and it's on its journey through the changes. When the previous government made changes 4 or 5 years ago, that meant that there were a small number of private training organisations that were then able to deliver work-based learning in addition to the industry training organisations that had been doing it for a long time. For those existing PTEs and employers and learners, nothing is changing, nothing's proposed to change, they just carry on as they are. So say MAST or the skills consulting groups that have been doing work-based learning. There are now 2 new PTEs delivering work-based learning, and that's BCITO and MITO. So they used to be ITOs, and they've now become PTEs, and that change was made on the 1st of January. But there are still 7 work-based learning divisions that were previously part of the Te Pūkenga NZIST big polytech group, and they have gone through a transition process whereby those 7 are now reporting to one of the new industry skills boards. So that's HITO, Primary ITO, Career Force, Connexus, Earn Learn, Competence, and Service IQ. Now, if you're an employer or a learner associated with one of those 7, there was no change on the 1st of January when that ownership structure changes. But in this presentation, Bridget's going to talk through what's going to be happening now, because there are decisions which need to be taken by the middle of 2027 about where those learners and programs transition to in the future. And there are options, but there's no need to panic. It's not happening today or tomorrow, but there are discussions which are happening out with industry and employers. And so this presentation is to start to explain what those conversations are. So I'll hand over to Bridget now to take you through the meat of the presentation.
Good morning. Right, so we're going to talk a little bit about what the new vocational education training system looks like that has been in place from 1 January, and really just wanting to use this to help industry and employers understand all the terms that we're using and what the structures ended up like, recognising that government likes to have a lot of complex structures and a lot of acronyms. So this is the chance to dig in and really, really understand it. In terms of the overall philosophy and system design of the new system, there's a few things that were sort of pulled out as really, really important. One of them was around making sure that there was regional decision making, and that's shown in our polytech sector, which you'll see is separating out and becoming regionally led again. And the other really important one was around industry involvement in vocational education and training. And that's really relevant to this conversation. So we're trying to provide a lot more opportunities for industry voice in the decision that we're making. That's a massive opportunity, and it's kind of exciting to have that coming through, but it does put quite a lot of pressure on industry to understand what's happening and to respond to queries. So there's a balance to be had there, and webinars like this are to help make that easier. The other thing I'd like to highlight from the VET changes, and this is something that obviously was very important to people, is that this system we stand up is fiscally sound and had good value for money. There's been a lot of talk over recent years of costs associated with our vocational education and training. So when we're making decisions for the future, we want to make sure that they are really, really sustainable, because it does no one good if it can't continue. So that's going to be a big part of our decision making over the next few years as well. So as of 1 January, a whole lot of changes to the system were implemented. So while people were waking up from their New Year's, this whole new world began, and an immense amount of work happened to make that come into place. There are 10 polytechs that have been stood up regionally now. So they are operating independently, whereas previously they were operating under the group of Te Pūkenga. There's 4 more polytechs that are going through processes at the moment, and their future will be decided this year. Another really big change was the work-based learning divisions, as we said, with the old ITOs moving into the industry skill board as a temporary place while they find their future. And Gillian's already mentioned the 2 that moved straight back out again, who were super early, BCITO and MITO. The other change that came in was around our WDCs and ISBs. So you may previously have dealt with WDCs, which were Workforce Development Councils. They had the role of organising all the qualifications and standards, but also doing a lot of industry engagement about workforce needs. Those 6 WDCs were replaced with 8 industry skill boards, or ISBs, on the 1st of January. These new industry skill boards have similar roles to the WDCs. The industries have been divided up slightly differently because there's a different number, but like their predecessor, they have that role around qualifications and industry voice. They also advise TC directly on what industry's needs are, and so they're going to be a really important contact for you going forward. Gillian's already talked about providers, but I just wanted to highlight here the difference between the ISBs and providers. if you've been involved in work-based learning for a long time, you'll remember the old ITOs. And ITOs did both qualification development, industry voice, and delivery. And those things were woven together. This has pulled them apart, and that's been in place now for a few years. So the provider that delivers your training, that writes the programs, that shows up in your doorstep, is a separate entity to the one that writes the qualification and asks for your insights. So both of these relationships are really important, and it's good to understand which part does which particular thing for you. In the year or two ahead, we've got some more change coming. So 1 January was definitely a real landmark day in terms of changes, but there is more to come. Many of you will have written submissions and been involved in various campaigns we've had to ask your opinion on things over at least the last year. There were different models of work-based learning put out for consultation. How many ISBs do we want? Who do you want to lead the ISBs? Huge amount of consultation. And we've had a lot come in from a lot of different industries. One of the things I want to really reassure you of is when you write those documents and those responses, they are read. As someone who's read a lot of these in the last year, they really are interesting and valuable. Mostly, I'm really impressed with how much people have engaged with the system, they've understood it, they've thought about implications, and all of that is feeding into the decisions that we make, but also the discussions that we have. So please recognise that those are really, really valued. In saying that, though, we are going to ask for a little bit more. And we appreciate that this is asking a lot. There's a terrible balance between wanting the industry to lead, but also recognising that puts pressure on you. There are two key areas that are going to be coming out at the moment to you for further comment. The first is about those current work-based learning arrangements, and these are the 7 work-based learning divisions or old ITOs that are sitting in the ISBs at the moment. The ISB location is a temporary home, and they must be out of there by the end of 2027. The other part that we're going to talk to you about is the future of the network of work-based learning provision. A little earlier in this process, but wanting to flag that because that will be coming your way as well. I'll get into a bit more detail on those as we go in. So then if we talk about the current work-based learners and those work-based learning divisions. So quite likely some of you have already had contact from people about this work, and they're saying, hey, we're going to transfer out to be something else. It might be that they're saying we're going to create our own PTE, we're going to move to a PTE, we want to work with a polytechnic. If you're having these kinds of discussions, that's what this is about. As industry, we want people to think really hard what's important to you in the provider that takes on this existing learning. So thinking about things like, is national important? Is consistent? Is it specialist? Is it industry owned? These are things that you will want to think about a great deal as these questions come out to you. And what kind of provider do you want? Is a PTE a good option for you? Or is a polytech a better option for you? Do you want to be with a wānanga? These are the kind of things that will be asked. The process that has gone through here is led by the ISB. So the Industry Skill Board is responsible for the transition plan for the existing provision, existing learners. They will make a recommendation to TC once they've talked to industry about what they want. So it's very important that what's put forward is reflecting what industry want. When that comes to TC, we look at 3 key things. So one is, do we believe that this has provided evidence that this is what industry wants? Really important. Is the model that's being put forward financially viable? Really, really important to know that it's sustainable and able to withstand the pressures that come. One of the things we'll consider there is if we're taking a small piece of provision out of a larger chunk and putting it on its own, is that enough to be viable? Because sometimes very small niche provision isn't viable on its own, and then we don't want that to fall over and the learners to miss out. So that's a huge consideration. And the third one, which is just as important, is what's the quality of training that the recommended solution is going to be able to deliver? Have they got the right people? Have they got the right skills? Is there a record of this delivering good quality programs where learners feel like they can succeed and employers are getting what they want? So quality just as important as all those others as well. So those are the three things wrapped together that will determine the outcome for that. The other piece is around a longer term way of thinking about the future of this network. So the previous piece we talked about was about what do we do with what we've got now. This is about what do we do for the future. And this is a lot about what do you need additionally out there that you don't have right now? Do you need more competition? Do you need more providers? If you do, what would that look like? Do you need something that targets a specific cohort of learners or a particular area? What does that look like for you? While keeping in mind, if it's a small sector, you probably can't have a huge number of providers and it be viable. So a lot of thinking to go into that. This engagement will be coming out to you from your industry skills boards as the experts on the sectors involved and who has the strongest relationships with industry. So they'll be guiding you through these discussions over the upcoming months. And when we get all the information in from this, this will inform our decisions about future funding for additional providers or changes to what we currently fund. We want to hold off making decisions about that right now until we've heard from industry. And I know that that's quite frustrating when people are keen to get into the market and get going, but we want to make the right decisions, and this is really, really important to it. Just to really clarify the difference between these two pieces of engagement, I've got a table coming up in a second that just explains the difference, because people are quite confused, and I don't blame you. I'm quite confused quite often about this. So currently enrolled, current programs moving, that's the transition piece, and that's the one that's going to move these work-based learning divisions out of the ISBs. Future network of provision, that's the one that's coming to you from the ISPs to go, hey, what do you want for the future? Quite different pieces of engagement, but obviously there's a relationship between them. Note that when you get the original one, which is about the transition, at some point you will be asked, hey, this is the recommended solution that we're going with, and we want all these learners to go to this provider. In that situation, the provider will be named. We will name the place that it's looking to go to. With the network of work-based learning provision, we're looking for the kind of provider. And the reason that we don't ask for specific providers on that side of the equation is that there's a lot of provider factors that may not be known. So you may say, in the world of building, we want to have 5 different providers who can deliver carpentry. Just an example, not real. If that was the case, we'd want to know whether they were national, whether they were targeted, whether they were work-based, all of those kind of things. But we wouldn't want you to list the names of providers that you'd want. The reason is that sometimes there are things about a provider that you may not realize and that we can see. An example of that would be when they have financial issues. We would not be funding a provider that has financial issues. And as an employer or industry, you might not know that. Same if they've had some compliance or quality issues, that may not be visible, but it is a red flag for us and we would hold back on that. For industry and employers at the moment, you're probably going to have some people knock on your door saying, support me, support me. That's a really hard situation to be in. I'm not saying don't support, please do. Please do support what's right, but be clear on what you are supporting. There was an instance recently where we received a letter and I think the employer was a bit confused. They changed their mind. Better that we understand it than not. And these slides will help you understand what you're being asked and what it means. We want to fund the right providers that will deliver what you need. And it's a really, really big, important piece of work. That is all of my slides. So we're going to probably move into the Q&A, and Gillian will come back on because she's much better at Q&A than me. I did just want to remind, because I can see a lot of my friends from ISBs and providers on the call as well, that we want to prioritise questions from industry associations and employers. you can tell this webinar is aimed at that group. It is different to what we'd present to providers, and we want to really focus on those groups first.
Thanks, Bridget. Hopefully that's helped understand things, and I can see Courtney's going to help us in terms of questions, but I can see a couple of questions. The first one, Bridget, you might be able to confirm. Will PTE delivered level 4 qualifications become approved for boost funding or fees free, similar to ITO approval?
Trying to understand that one and pull it apart.
I think what I would say, being a PTE or an ITO and having a program approved shouldn't make any difference to what you're eligible for. So I'll go out on a limb and I'll say that in terms of Mackenzie, in terms of the question. But if you want more detail, please just email it through and we can probably answer that. Lewis, as a representative for manufacturing sector, I'm interested in what increased industry involvement will look like in practice on day-to-day basis, and particularly around standard and qualification development. Look, and this is to do with the size of ISBs compared to the size of WDCs. One of the conversations that all of the ISBs have been having with TC is ensuring that they are prioritising that standard and qualification development and the stakeholder engagement that's required to inform that in terms of the functions that they have. And so I know for all of the ISBs, they're actively looking at how they put in place the right engagement and stakeholder groups to be informed the work that they're doing. So I've got confidence that they'll all be doing that. But Lewis, that's probably best directed to your particular industry skills board. They've only been in place since January, and so I think a little bit of patience is going to be required. You know, things may be done a little bit differently, but there is an absolute commitment from everyone involved in vocational education to ensure that industry are informing the education and training in the vocational space. And TEC will be looking for evidence of that when we're making funding decisions, and the ISBs are very keen to ensure that they're structured and can be set up to do that. Paula, how can sectors that don't currently have work-based learning ensure they are well served by the future VET provision? Paula, I think as part of the engagement, you may not have work-based learning or an ITO, but you will have an industry skills board. And so when the industry skills board is coming out and talking to you about your needs for the future, that's where to feed in what your requirements are. Specifically. And I know for some sectors it's challenging, and one of the things will be that vocational may not be the right sector for a particular industry. Bridget?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that too, because we have got a few sectors that don't have work-based learning at the moment, and they will absolutely still be involved in the engagement that we're doing around the future network. Because one of the things we want to hear is this something that you want? So this is a great opportunity for you to say, yes, that is something that we're hoping to explore in the future, or actually we think the best way of delivering is provider-based. So please tell us. I think that's a really great opportunity for us to hear.
Cool. Thanks, Bridget. Ben, yeah, timeframes. So one of the things we're doing is we are prioritising the work of the 7 work-based learning divisions and their ISBs in terms of those conversations to be happening sort of first in terms of those industry engagements. For the industry sectors that are related to BCITO or MITO, they are likely to be the first industry sectors that we start seeing the ISBs having that network of provision conversation. But I think it's a really valid point to ensure that industry gets sufficient time to be able to respond. So we will work with the ISBs to, as early as possible, set out some proposed timeframes, and so that people can also get ready if they know that in, say, July or June, this is the questions that are going to be coming out to you. As I said, there's no need to panic about, a lot of these things. We want to make sure that industry have enough time, but we also need the information to inform other decisions that are being made. But we'll work with the ISBs to be able to communicate with you, especially on that timing around the network of providers. Sorry, Jason, I'm just reading your question. So TEC doesn't develop the quals. That's absolutely what your Industry Skills Board does. TEC's role is funding, but the New Zealand Qualifications Association, so NZQA, work very closely with your Industry Skills Board. So if there are changes or things that need to be made, that relationship is where changes will be made with respect to qualifications. But to Bridget's earlier point, industry, we're very keen to have a voice into education and training, but we do recognise that comes with obligations and time commitments and all of those things as well. And some industries are better positioned than others to be able to take things forward at points of time. So I know that will be one of the things that the various industry skills boards will be working through, especially as they phase out their review of different qualifications. Cherie. Home and community sector that signs up trainees with Career Force. But everything with Career Force will continue as it is until such time as those learners and programs transition to another organisation.
Just picking up on that Career Force question, I can see that there's a bit of change potentially about in-house assessment versus assessment by the provider. And so very much that is a provider decision. So it's a Career Force decision, not a TEC decision. So it is one to talk to them about to find what's right for you as an employer with them. It may, and I'm just imagining it could be a quality control issue, it could be something to do with that, but definitely a conversation to have directly with Career Force, not something we're telling them to do.
But also something that your ISB will be able to help in terms of, because I think in terms of a qualification, understanding that balance of where assessment's done are probably things between the ISB and NZQA that they can work with you on as well. What does the relationship between ISBs and TEC look like? Well, you're already asking one side of the relationship at the moment. Look, we work really closely. Within my team, I have dedicated relationship managers for every ISB. Tim, our CE, and myself are meeting with all of the ISB councils. We are here as a critical friend. We're here to support. And one of the key things is to keep reinforcing what are the key priorities of the work that the ISBs need to do. Because as soon as someone says industry voice, a whole lot of other people outside education and training think, oh, I can go and talk to those people about all sorts of things like immigration or something else. ISBs are small, perfectly formed organisations, and their focus is on that qual and standard setting function primarily. And then obviously their engagement with the sector and giving advice to TEC. So it's really important that TEC and the ISBs work really closely together. And so that's how we've started out, and that's how we intend to carry on. And as part of that, we will be looking for feedback from validation from them that they're actually meeting their needs of their industry sectors, which is a hard ask because, as you guys know, industry is a very broad range of people and employers, and you have different views on things. So, but I think the ISBs are well placed to navigate those with you. So the ISBs have all of the materials, all of the work that Workforce Development Councils did, all of that has been transitioned across to the new ISBs. So all of that material, information, knowledge has moved across. So nothing should be lost in that space. All of the ISBs have been initially staffed with resources and people that came out of Workforce Development Councils for that continuity. Now, as things move forward, ISBs may find different ways of doing things or want to talk to industry about doing things in a different way, especially given their scale, but they have access to all that information. So if you've already told a WDC something, you shouldn't need to retell it to an ISB. There was an enormous amount of work that the Workforce Development Councils did in the last 6 months of last year. Obviously, an enormous amount of information coming into the new ISB. So, as I said, have only been sort of started since the beginning of this year. Is there consideration for funding work-based learning programs may be low per course, but are essential skills? Look, funding for work-based learning is not something Bridget and I determine. That's a process that's agreed with the Minister and through budget each year. There's obviously been some changes to funding for work-based learning, but I think what we can say is the amount of funding that's going to support work-based learning now is greater than the funding that used to go to ITOs, because the government put in additional funding to support all the qualification and development work, whereas that used to have to be funded in the same amount of money that was funding work-based learning. So for all industries, the level of funding is more than it used to be. Would you like more? Absolutely. But, as we know, we're living in pretty fiscally constrained times, and that applies to education just as it applies to everything else. One of the things that TEC does look to do is to ensure that where are we putting our funding, because we don't have a bottomless pit of funding, towards those really key priority areas. And we will be looking for ISBs to be able to give us advice about what are those priority qualifications. Also, what are the ones that aren't actually meeting the needs and maybe we shouldn't be investing in? I'm really keen to understand that. I would much prefer that people were spending time developing qualifications that really met the needs of industry than continuing on with ones that would, training learners and things that when they got into the workplace, they couldn't actually do what you as employers need to happen. So that is what I have had the conversation with each of the ISBs about so far. For startup PTEs, yep. If you are a new provider or thinking about becoming a PTE, one of the things that we have been working on is what is the information that we can make available. We've also run some specific webinars for new PTEs, and as we're working through this process, that might be something else that we do. I mean, one of the things that we are always saying is it actually takes quite a lot of work to set up a PTE, and it comes with quite a lot of compliance obligations and all of those things. So just being passionate about a particular industry doesn't necessarily always get you across the line. So if anyone's thinking about that, then you should get in contact, and Bridget is very good at being able to take you through the ABCs of a PTE, and we work really closely with NZQA. And if people would like us to run another one of those webinars like we did last year about what you need to do to become a PTE, I'm sure that we can do that again, Bridget. Is our geographic area limited, and when do you envisage the decision we made to allow expansion to a nationwide offering? Look, Maria, that is a very provider by provider question. It depends on your industry sector, it depends whether there are other providers, and it depends on these decisions that are being taken at the moment about transition. So I think it would be better for your specific instance to contact us separately on that. But at the moment, as Bridget said, our main focus is on supporting the transitions for those 7 work-based learning divisions and ensuring that those learners, employers and their programs are transitioned to a safe place where they can be well supported before we start opening up and adding a whole increased number of providers. Will industries have the opportunity to speak with outside? Yes, you're absolutely. So your ISBs will be putting in place engagement plannings and processes with you. We're just alerting you to sort of the 2 of the conversations that we're really interested in that will be happening, but the ISBs will be leading that, and in terms of their communications with you, they'll be able to share those things. And I know there are a number of ISBs on this call, so I'm sure they're listening intently to that. So the apprenticeship boost is something that is, any decisions on that would be taken as part of budget. So budget is going to be released at the end of May. So if there are any changes or anything in relation to that, that information would be shared at that time. The TEC website, once budget has happened, we always put articles on our website that say these are the changes that have happened that impact the tertiary sector. So that would be a good place to look. Jenny, I know you're talking about outdoor education and qualifications. As I talked about, one of the challenges that we face is that there is only a certain amount of funding, and this government has been very clear that it wants as much funding as possible directed to what they consider to be their priority areas. And those priority areas are determined by things the government decided, but also things that workforce development councils have told us in terms of specific qualifications. What that does mean is that for some sectors, the amount of funding or our ability to increase the amount of funding is very limited. And a number of PTEs have seen that in terms of the funding decisions we made for 26. To be honest, I don't see that changing in the future. So what I do see changing in the future is that we're going to have different providers supporting those 7 work-based learning areas that are currently with the ISBs. But with respect to the rest of the sector, you know, at the moment, we are probably got less money for next year than we've got this year. So the work our teams are doing is looking at where are the areas that we might actually have to pull back on. And I think that's a really important thing, because if you're setting up a PTE or working in a PTE or a polytech, you cannot assume that if you decide you're going to write a whole lot of business, that TEC will be able to fund it. We currently have quite a different situation across the sector this year, where we have a much higher number of what we would call unfunded learners. So that's where the learner's been able to say enroll with the university, but TEC doesn't pay our usual tuition subsidy. The university has to rely just on the fees that the student pays. Now, we haven't really had that situation much before. It's always been quite a small number. We're now in a situation where those numbers are significantly higher, because the government as a whole has, for this year, determined to only fund 99% of the demand that was forecast to happen for this year. What I can tell you is the enrolments that are actually happening this year are above what that forecast demand was, which means that the gap between the number of enrolments and the amount of funding we have has actually got bigger. And so for a particular industry, I understand how tough that is. But also for us, it's extremely difficult in making those decisions. So we just released our plan guidance this week, which goes out to all providers, and it's tried to be very clear about the areas where we'll be funding and the areas where we'll be potentially looking to pull back in areas. And one of those is if learners are enrolling in programs and they're not actually getting the qualification at the end of it, and the number of those learners is too high in a particular organisation, why would the government fund it? That's the problem. Or why, as an employer, do you want to have someone working for you that never actually gets that qualification? Those are all things that are really valid things and issues that we're having to balance up at the moment. So thanks for the question. Jenny took me down a little rabbit hole.
Talk about Dave's question here because it's quite close to my heart about SMEs and small businesses. So, Dave, it's a problem I'm really conscious of. How do SMEs involve themselves in the consultation and things that are going on? I guess one answer is if you've got an industry association, use it, but completely accept that that is not everyone. One of the things we've said with the transitions is when we ask for evidence of industry, we want to see industry associations, large employers and small employers represented in that evidence. And we've said, get creative on how you engage with small employers because they haven't got as much time. We know that. So run a survey, run a group meeting, take notes, these kind of things. So I really encourage you to try and find ways to be involved because we do want to hear it. We're encouraging people who work with you to try and get them as well. So it is part of the landscape and we do want to see it, especially in the industries that have heaps of small businesses, sole traders, things like that. We're really conscious of it. Thank you for that question.
Cool. Great, Bridget. Yes, we are. We're interested in everyone's views, no matter what size business that you're in. Kelly, your question about industry wanting to become a PTE. I really think, Bridget, this is where it's probably might be good to run another webinar because there are several industries that want to become a PTE. It's not all it's cut out to be, really. You know, it comes with a lot of obligations and requirements from everything around pastoral code of care, around looking after learners, to, you know, the conditions that you have to meet to get government funding, all of those things. So whilst NZQA have done a lot of work to simplify the process to register, that doesn't change the fact that it actually takes a lot of work, one, to become registered, but secondly, to then actually be able to maintain it and to be a high quality operating PTE. And that work may not be worth it for some industries. It may be way better to find an existing PTE who has an interest in supporting particular industry sectors. Can an ISB be a provider? Not after the end of next year. So there is ISBs are not supposed to be providers. There is just an allowance in the legislation for this period through until next year. If an ISB still is owning one of the work-based learning divisions, then they are technically deemed to be a provider for this next period of time. But as soon as that work-based learning division moves out, they're not a provider. Because we're very conscious that there is a conflict there, and going forward, ISBs won't be allowed to own a PTE. Yes, so hopefully this has answered the next question. And ISBs are very conscious about that. And the way that you will see is the work-based learning divisions are very separate from the rest of the ISB. They own them, but there is no integration of their staff and their operations through this period. You can contact either ourselves or the ISB, Kirsten, if you've got questions. Yes, so Bridget talked about the fact that as part of the different industries are in different ISBs, and some of them belong to different, the work-based learning divisions are part of different ISBs. If an ISB is looking after a work-based learning division that they're not the industry for, their obligation to us is to go and talk to those industries. So it will be the industry related to the apprentice that has the say, not necessarily, and they need to make sure that that information is provided. So hopefully that will do. And I think that's the case of like Learn, which is with Connexus, is probably the best example. Bridget.
And just to add to that, when we did the allocation of industries to the ISBs, we were really conscious that there are some industries that work together that are now under two separate ISBs. There was no way of doing it that we didn't create some of that. We did look at a million variations, and because of the way that some groups work together, they did end up split up. But one of the great sort of fundamental philosophies behind the ISBs is that they work collaboratively, and they do. We can see them working collaboratively. So where there is industry crossover, both ISBs or more than two ISBs will be talking to each other. So please have faith that that's not necessarily a deal breaker, even though it's a little bit complicated in terms of structure.
Yeah, that's great. And what we've seen to date is the ISBs are working very collaboratively together. I meet with all of the CEs together regularly, so that's an opportunity for those conversations. So Sarah, VET starts at level 3. How do you see this affecting schools, trades academies? Well, you will have heard the conversations that are coming from Minister Stanford about her proposed changes for NCA, the really positive change, which is looking to have industry-informed qualifications integrated into those pathways and those connections. What I can say is the Ministry of Education is starting those conversations with the ISBs now in terms of making sure everything's connected. So I think from an industry point of view, you should actually see that there will be better connections between the schooling system and moving into vocational education going forward. And trades academies are a really large part of that. So watch this space. Oh, yep. Can I say the question she's answering? Very good point. Sorry, very bad form on my part, Lauren. Is there an encouragement to start up new PTEs if there is a sector need? So I think we've pretty much covered that. I think you really have to think about whether there is a sector need or is there someone else that's better placed for that PTE, because you do need a level of critical mass to be able to support the industries and the learners and all of those things in a really good way. Because the last thing we want is a whole pile of small organisations, all incredibly passionate, but finding it really hard to make ends meet. And that flows through to not being able to provide the right support that both employers and the trainees will need in the future. NCQA is an authority, not an association. Apologies in terms of it is a Crown entity. I was trying not to use abbreviations, but as usual, I got that wrong. So apologies, Patrick. Will the ISBs recognise and develop a framework for skills standard? That's a conversation to have with the ISBs. So I would go directly and something that you can cover in your engagement with the ISB.
Just looking at Kelly's question about the PTEs, and Kelly, I'm really happy to talk to you at any point. Do recommend you have a look at the webinar we ran, because this exact question was in the webinar. It's for those that aren't reading the chat as fast as Gillian and I, it's a question about whether there could be a simpler pathway for industry to become a PTE. The short answer is no, and there's actually a really good reason for this, and it's one of the few times where I'll say government bureaucracy is a good thing, and that's because the quality of a PTE is super, super important. And we need a lot of faith in the organisation before they are given that status. So I do think that the checks that the NZQA go through are amazingly important. That doesn't mean that we won't help. And NZQA and I work really closely together around this industry stuff at the moment, and we have got some industry PTEs going through it. So we are supporting and helping every way we can, but we don't want to in any way lower or change those standards. So I appreciate the question, but I hope you can appreciate the answer too.
Thanks, Bridget. I'm very conscious that we've got 3 minutes to go. Dave's raising some really good points about the things that are important to industry and maybe the disconnect between what industry is looking for and how some of the qualifications of programs are delivered or structured at the moment. Great conversation to be having with your ISB. That's what I like to hear. Really, the whole point of the investment in industry skills boards and that link into industry is to ensure that we're funding, TC is funding training, which is going to give you the employers you need in the future. Kelly's asking about micro-credentials. Look, I think micro-credentials are evolving, but like everything, they're not like a quick fix. But they have some really important roles to play, and they work extremely well in some sectors. So I think they will continue to evolve. NZQA and TC have been doing some work to try to simplify the processes around getting approval for micro-credentials. And I do know in talking to providers that one of the barriers sometimes is the investment to develop what is quite a small amount of learning. But I think as we move forward, hopefully micro-credentials will continue to grow. Right, I'm going to take the last question, which is, we've heard in the past, new PTEs are being discouraged from starting. I think to Bridget's point, we're not discouraging, but what we are saying, you need to go in it with your eyes wide open, because there has to be a very clear rationale as to what you're going to be delivering that someone else can't. So, the so what, but also there is a lot to being a PTE, and we want to make sure that people understand that up front before they invest a lot of time and energy and then actually find that it doesn't deliver what a particular industry needs. Well, look, we've got through a lot of questions today. I'm sure we've probably only scratched the surface. Thank you very much to the people that joined the session. Please send through any questions to either ourselves or to the ISBs. We'll make the PDF available for everyone, and look out for these sessions and engagements that will be coming from your ISBs or work-based learning divisions. And if you want to know what happens in budget, then make sure you visit the TEC website and we will have all of that information. So hopefully we didn't talk too much gobbledygook. Thank you very much, Bridget. But look, we are here to support you. We want industry and employers to have the employers that you need so that your industries can thrive. So thank you very much, and have a great day. Ka kite ono.